first one is a bit more reflective in nature. This deals with teaching philosophy and also personality factors, your personality factors that also might affect your teaching and your teaching style. And I say teaching philosophy because people, especially new teachers, often have kind of a disconnect between what they say they believe in as teachers and what they really do. If I asked you, your teaching philosophy, what are your attitudes, your assumptions about teaching, you might tell me something that sounds really good, but a lot of new teachers really don't know how to implement that. They might have their explicit, what we call their explicit philosophy, what they say they believe in, but they might not know how to implement that if they haven't really studied educational methods, or if they've not really taught for a few years and also looked into methods of teaching in a particular field. And so you might actually have an implicit philosophy, that unconscious philosophy that is actually quite different, even contradictory. Those implicit or unconscious assumptions that may come from how you were taught, how you learned as a student, and what your teachers did to you and how your teachers taught you. You will probably borrow from that and carry that over and teach that way, especially at first. And so there can actually be a disconnect, even a contradiction between your implicit and explicit philosophy. So we'll talk about that. Then we'll talk about particular teaching philosophies according to one inventory that was on the website, and then we'll talk about personality factors. First, I want to show you a few videos, and I want you to think about the kind of attitudes that these teachers show in their teaching. Maybe, could you turn out maybe some of the lights? So, this first one is called The Angry Teacher. It's in Chinese. Okay, if I have any teachers like that, okay. This one is a math professor or a science professor. This one is called Worst Professor.
That is for 2 terms, that is for 4 terms, for 8, and the general solution. Whatever you have terms with that is there. Then you do such kind of drawing. Can you do it? If you have your homework, do some drawings. They don't ask for it, but do it. Send the drawing. When you have some homework for the next time, exactly of this kind, do it. And do some drawing. Okay? Are you doing? Sure? Right. You have to do some drawing because you are very good with the computer. And if you are good with the computer, you know to do it. And if you are not to do it, do it. And then ask for special permission to do it. Do it. Simply ask to do it. Oh.
Okay, what awe-inspiring teaching that was. Okay, third one, this is the boring economics teacher. Now, the first two were real examples, one from a high school class and the second one from a college class. This is a fictional example. It's from a famous Hollywood movie from the 1980s called Ferris Bueller's Day Off. This is a famous scene from that movie.
In 1930, the Republican-controlled House of Representatives, in an effort to alleviate the effects of the, anyone? The Great Depression, passed the, the tariff bill, the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, which anyone raised or lowered, raised tariffs in an effort to collect more revenue for the federal government. Did it work? Anyone? Anyone know the effects? It did not work, and the United States sank deeper into the Great Depression. Today, we have a similar debate over this. Anyone know what this is, class? Anyone? Anyone? Anyone seen this before? The Laffer curve. Anyone know what this says? It says that at this point on the revenue curve, you will get exactly the same amount of revenue as at this point. This is very controversial. Does anyone know what Vice President Bush called this in 1980? Anyone? Something DOO economics. Voodoo economics.
Okay. So the question I will ask you is this, maybe talk to a neighbor for a moment. These three teachers, the angry teacher, the worst professor, and the boring economics teacher, what kind of attitudes do they reflect in their teaching? What kind of attitudes do they have towards teaching? So maybe talk to a neighbor for about a minute. What kind of attitudes do these teachers reflect? So talk to a neighbor. Go ahead and come back together now. Back to your seats. So the first one, the angry teacher, what kind of attitude or maybe teaching philosophy does she exhibit? The angry teacher. Angry, of course, but what else?
And she was like authoritative because she was ignoring students, why students were doing something else, not focusing on her lecture. So she didn't think about the students in like position. She thought about only herself. No interaction at all.
Okay.
She didn't ask at all.
Okay, no interaction. Extremely teacher-centered, and she expects everyone to pay absolute attention to her, and she doesn't care about the students, and maybe there might be a reason that they don't want to pay attention to her. She probably wasn't a very exciting teacher, I guess. Any other observations about the angry teacher? Okay, how about the second one, the one called worst professor? Actually, you can find it on YouTube. Just search for worst professor ever. Who was like a math or science teacher. What did you think of that teacher?
He's also authoritative, and he might think, I know everything and no idiots.
Okay. So in a sense, he's kind of authoritarian. Okay. What else?
He wasn't so explanatory, he just asked what the student should do.
Yes.
And she just said, okay, just draw it. But because you know how to use computer, just draw it. So she wasn't very using any reasons.
Okay. Yeah, so just do it, like a Nike commercial. No explanation, so he just assumes you should understand what he wants, what he expects. Have you had teachers like that? Doesn't really understand maybe that the students might need some specific guidance on what to do and what he would expect, what kinds of graphs should you do for his assignments. Any other observations? Okay. The third video, fictional, but it illustrates a lot of things that maybe you've seen, maybe we've all experienced. The boring economics teacher, a high school economics teacher in this Hollywood movie, what does that reflect? What does that show about his teaching attitude?
There's no interaction with students.
Okay.
But he doesn't have any interest in teaching.
No interest in teaching?
Yeah.
Okay.
Seems like he is ignoring students because, do you know? Actually, you don't know that kind of attitude towards students, right? It's like no more information, no more schemata from the students. He didn't expect at all.
Okay. So, like the others, it's a very teacher-centered model, extremely teacher-centered. I am the teacher and I know everything and you don't know anything. So let me just dump some information on you by talking to myself in front of you. Why do you think he became a teacher?
Stable job. Stable job.
Okay, a stable job, so it's just a job. Maybe his heart is not into it.
Show off his knowledge.
Okay. Yeah, show off his knowledge. That's a good motivation for becoming a teacher. Show off your knowledge, enjoy talking to yourself, hearing yourself talk in front of people, and maybe the power trip. You know, some people start out teaching that way. Okay, any other observations? Have you had teachers like that?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I once had a teacher like that, and I dropped the course after 2 weeks. It was so bad. I didn't learn anything, and it was like every day at the end of class, I wasn't just asleep. I felt like I was in a coma. You know, that's what that kind of class does to you. So these are teachers who probably haven't thought about why they're teaching, why they do what they do, why they do what they do in the classroom, how they interact with students, how to maybe get the students more active in the class. A lot of you probably experience classes like that. You sit, you passively soak up knowledge, and the teacher talks. The teacher has all the knowledge, and the teacher is trying to basically pour his or her knowledge into your head like that. Does that work? Can you learn by passively sitting in a classroom and just soaking up knowledge from lectures and from the textbooks?
Superficially, yes, but actually not. It's not happening.
Okay, and why not?
Because students have to pay attention to it. So it's interaction, discussion, so that they have to go through a thinking process. But actually, students are very passive. They don't think about it. They don't pay attention whatever they say. So it's not. It's from one ear to the other ear. So it goes out like that.
Yes. So there has to be a thinking process involved in learning that requires activity, that requires student interaction. And over the next few weeks, we are going to talk more about that, how that works mentally, how it is that people learn. But today we're going to focus on you as a teacher, because you might be a teacher in some capacity or another, or at least a presenter or a lecturer of some kind, even if it's not an actual teaching job, some kind of position where you are basically training other people, instructing other people, teaching other people. And so I asked you, if you went to the website, to fill out this teaching inventory. It's called the PAEI, the Personality of Adult Education Inventory. How many of you filled out the PAEI? How many of you did that? A couple of you. What were your results?
The high score is B, and the low score is H.
So you mainly came out as a behaviorist.
Yeah.
Okay. Were you high in some other things also?
Yeah,
R, a radical? Okay, that's interesting. We'll talk about what these mean in a moment. Okay, and you took it?
I found out myself to be radical and progressive.
Radical progressive, okay. So what does that mean, radical? Does it mean that he's a communist? No, not radical in that sense. What do these terms mean? In case you didn't, did anyone else take the inventory and do the results? Okay, well, I'll have you talk about these in a minute. Let's talk about these terms briefly. There's explanation in there's a manual, the TPS manual, which you can look at later. And these are really helpful to think about, because these questions, what is your philosophy, your implicit philosophy, what really would guide you? If I put you into a classroom and said teach, what you really would do would be guided by these, which may be influenced by your past, what you've experienced as a student, not necessarily by what you say you believe, but what you implicitly, subconsciously believe or assume, based probably on your past experience and such. And this is important because this will, maybe you will apply for a job that's more teaching focused, where you have to write a teaching statement or a teaching philosophy statement as one of your job application documents. So some jobs that are more teaching focused, like at a teacher's college, a liberal arts college, as opposed to a research university like this one, but more of a college just focused on teaching, where teachers just teach and you don't have to do research, but they just want you to teach. Or it could be a junior college, it could be a high school, it could be other kinds of teaching or training positions. Kangsa perhaps, Kangsa or adjunct position. and for the purpose of that document, but also even if you don't have to submit that kind of document to apply for a job, for the job interview, they might ask you questions about your teaching. What are your attitudes about teaching? What's your philosophy of teaching? What would you do in a classroom? How would you teach X? Why do you want to become a teacher? So for the job interview, for your other application materials, like your cover letter, you have to explain why you want to become a teacher. And most of all, just to reflect about yourself and how you teach, how you would teach, and why. What is driving you? What kind of assumptions do you have beneath there that would actually drive or dictate what you do in the classroom? So according to this inventory, there are a few others that are kind of like it, but this is a good, well-known one. People tend to fall into these categories. There's the liberal view, or the classical view of education. So what is a classical or liberal approach or attitude towards education for why people need to learn something, or why you would teach something? What is the kind of classical liberal education ethic?
Well, I think the classical means that the students are kind of not like teacher-centered in one way. Liberal means that more freedom to students, so that like student-centered, so that it's open to students, like a collaborative between a teacher and a student.
Yeah.
Classical, maybe, which is a very typical form of teaching philosophy in Korea.
Yeah. I think when you say teacher-centered and collaborative, that's probably more like the progressive attitude. The liberal view means this: education is to make you a well-rounded person, an intellectually well-rounded person, and especially undergraduate programs are based on this, the classical Western liberal educational philosophy and such. So one purpose of education is to make you a well-rounded person, and so our job as teachers is to fill you with as much knowledge so you are enlightened people. If you can imagine, this comes from the Western Renaissance and Enlightenment. This is probably also partially consistent with the Eastern Confucian view of education too, where education is for the purpose of making you an intellectually well-rounded and well-informed person. To some degree, yes, so you can participate in democracy and be a good citizen, but mainly just for your own intellectual development and growth. And also to train you for your potential job by filling you with as much knowledge and expertise in the field. And so if you're teaching future biologists, according to this view, your job is to teach them as much biology so that they are experts. So your job is to produce experts, but it's kind of an information transfer model. So it's kind of teacher-centered. It tends to be. It doesn't necessarily have to be, but it tends to be teacher-centered because the teacher is the master and the students are kind of the newbies, the beginners, the kind of blank slates. And so my job is to fill your head as much knowledge about this field so that you will be experts, you will be masters after 4 years. And that's the classical or liberal approach to education. It tends to be teacher-centered. But it does have really good ideals of promoting intellectual development, well-roundedness, and expertise in the field. And to a certain degree, that is valid because teachers are experts, and there are reasons why we have teachers. The behaviorist, well, the angry teacher is probably an extreme example of the behaviorist. How many of you learned English here in Korea by doing a lot of drilling and repetition and maybe dictation exercises, repeating after the teacher, repeat after me class, okay? You probably learned English in a very behavioristic way. It's very teacher-centered, and education is viewed as behavioral change, behavior modification. If I'm going to make you learn English, I'm going to make you imitate. So there's a lot of imitation involved. It's kind of an imitation model. You learn by imitating. And if it's English, for example, this is probably the best example here in the Korean system. You're going to learn by doing drilling, dictation, kind of the army style of learning. That's maybe how you learn English. And other classes tend to be like that too. If you did a lot of memorization, a lot of memorizing vocabulary, memorizing grammar rules, that's kind of behaviorist and maybe also liberal also. That tends to be behavioristic. Memorize, repeat, imitate. drill, drill, drill. Drill and kill, we call it. The drill and kill approach. That, of course, comes from the behavioral psychologist like Skinner, and that had an influence on education, especially starting in the early 20th century of America. But it also kind of feeds into the kind of Confucian ideal that the teacher's the master and the student learn by training. If you come out strongly behaviorist in this, that's probably not good. Any of these are kind of, I mean, in and of themselves, these are all kind of good in a way, in their own way. But if you're strongly behaviorist, you're going to make your students' lives very uncomfortable, and you might want to moderate that. This would be appropriate, for example, if you're teaching somebody tennis, you know, or piano, because it's a lot of training and repetition. But otherwise, for most kinds of learning, pure behaviorism, it doesn't really lead to deep learning. It just makes students suffer. So if you're a pure behaviorist, you might want to moderate this, and we'll talk about how to moderate that. Now, progressive, this goes to John Dewey. Maybe you've heard of John Dewey and his pragmatic or progressive approach to education. He was an education reformer in the early to mid 20th century, and he partially would agree with this, but he would say, well, it shouldn't be too teacher-centered. He kind of takes a little bit of the emphasis off the teacher-centeredness and kind of wants to make it a little more student-centered. And he says, education is not just to make you smart as you can and know as much as you can, but it should be practical training. So if I'm training you to be biologist, instead of just listen to me lecture, I would want you to do stuff, hands-on learning. So the progressive education focuses on hands-on learning and also more interactive learning. You learn by doing, and you learn by doing things, you know, with classmates together, or teacher-student interaction and student-to-student interaction. So if you're going to learn biology, you need to do stuff. You need to do hands-on learning. If you're going to learn a language, there needs to be more actual practice. So your traditional English education in Korea was highly teacher-centered. You maybe listened to lectures about grammar. That was pretty useless, right? It's not helpful unless you actually do something, unless you actually practice it. And there is maybe a lot of practice here, but it's very artificial. It's very structured. Like the teacher provides you a model of how to do something in English, how to say something in English, and then you just practice this kind of very artificial model.
Sometimes we have to mix together, because when you start teaching we have very specific effect, because we are supposed to give an input to students. However, as time goes by, we have to switch to progressive, because students has enough input, so it's time for them to use their output, so that we have the combination.
Yeah, so there are times when some of this is appropriate, not so much as a whole teaching philosophy, but in terms of maybe techniques, or like for learning a language, you first have to do some imitation and repetition to learn how to pronounce it, to learn the alphabet, or sometimes for beginning level stuff, when you first learn to play tennis, when you first learn certain things at certain levels, certain times, yes, certain behavioral techniques are appropriate. But if you do it all the time, students will not really learn very well. Progressive education says, let's learn practical skills, real life practical skills, to help you get a job by practicing. You're going to be better if you actually practice something and do hands-on learning, practical learning. So it's more practical in focus. So if you take that and you kind of extend it logically further, you get more of a humanistic view. And this goes back to the 60s, people like Carl Rogers and Maslow, humanistic psychology. So does anybody know what humanistic psychology would say about teaching? Well, in the humanistic kind of view that arose in the 1960s, the students are important as people, and the self-esteem of students is important. they need to realize who they are. They need to find their sense of self-worth and self-esteem. They need to be able to set their own goals and learn for their own benefit, not just to make them smart or well-trained, but to build their self-esteem and other basic psychological personal needs. And so there's an emphasis on making the classroom more student-friendly and student-centered, because it's not just about the teacher, and it's no longer the idea that the teacher is the master, but the teacher is more of a facilitator. And the students aren't completely dumb, they're not just blank slates, but they have background and experience that you can draw from, that you can use in order to connect with students. So the humanistic model is much more student-centered and more student-friendly, and puts even more emphasis on classroom interaction, interactive activities, and trying to make the students feel more comfortable and creating a friendly teaching environment where you're not authoritarian, but you kind of come down a little bit. You're not necessarily their friend, but you are more of a facilitator and a helper. And it's not about so much you transferring knowledge into their heads, but you help them to discover. You help them to learn on their own. So you might lecture some, but you're also going to do group activities and classroom activities where you give them some input or some information and have them learn on their own, maybe in groups or in pairs or outside of class. So there's more of an emphasis on what we call discovery-based learning. Instead of you just telling them, you know, probably students can learn better if you just provide the right input environment so that they can maybe discover things on their own. You give them some data, some kind of problems to work on, and they figure out by themselves by collaborating together in groups how to solve something or how to understand something on their own, rather than just me telling you how something works. I'll give you maybe a problem to solve or some information, and then you figure out on your own how something works. You discover the principle by yourselves, and there are actually valid psychological reasons where sometimes that can lead to deeper learning and better understanding. So you take that even a little further to more of a logical extreme, you get the radical approach. This does not mean politically radical. This doesn't mean that you're a lover of North Korea or anything. This goes back to a Brazilian educator named Paulo Ferreira, who lived in Brazil in the mid-20th century. At that time, Brazil was ruled by a dictatorship. And he was concerned with training poor people, giving them practical skills so that they could get jobs. People who had no education, people in poverty, but also not only so that they could get jobs and make a living, but that they would know enough that they could organize themselves and form unions and fight for their rights as people against the corrupt powers and machinery. So this is a focus on improving people's lives and improving the world through social change and social action. So giving people practical skills and also training them to change the world and make the world a better place. And one time I was doing this for professors, and one professor in my workshop was an engineering professor, and he was surprised to find from this test he was a radical. Why would a radical be in engineering? Actually, it kind of makes sense. He was interested in engineering because through engineering he wants to make the world a better place. He wants to improve people's lives, and he wants his students to also become engineers for the purpose of improving people's lives, not just to make money and get good jobs with the big companies, but to practically make the world a better place. So if you're a radical, you're interested in making the world a better place. You're interested in improving people's lives and their lot in life. So I know a lot of you haven't taken this test yet, but if you could group into one of these categories, think about which one would you prefer to be. What would you prefer your philosophy to be? Now, you don't have to be one or the other. Oftentimes when people take this test, they come out with a mixture. So some people might turn out to have a very high score in one category, like they might be progressive. Oftentimes people come out strong in 2 or 3 categories, like a progressive humanist, or a liberal progressive, or a liberal radical. Different combinations are possible. Occasionally a person might come out fairly high in almost everything. And there are reasons why you might not have one clear winner, and that could be because maybe your philosophy is kind of in flux. That is, it's maybe changing or it's inconsistent. So maybe you've encountered classes that were very traditional, very behavioristic and liberal, and maybe you had a few classes that were very progressive and humanistic, and you liked different aspects of both of them. So you've got kind of 2 different ideas, and you haven't really figured out which one you like or why. Or maybe you're, by nature, you're kind of a very progressive humanistic person, but you're teaching in a Hagwon where the Hagwon teacher the Hagwon boss makes you teach in a very, very behavioristic way, and that may have influenced you. So the way you teach, or the way you have to teach, might influence you. It could be you've just been exposed to different things and you're not sure. It's kind of in flux, maybe changing, maybe you've got some different contradictory attitudes and you haven't worked them out. So that could be a reason you come out high in several different categories. Or you could be an eclectic. That means you pick and choose. You like to pick and choose different bits from different categories, and that can be fine too, if it's for a principled way or principled reason. So I can imagine a person might have some ideals that are liberal. I want to make my students well-rounded, but to me that well-roundedness means learning by doing and by taking care of their self-esteem needs and making them feel comfortable. And I think maybe some of those liberal ideals ought to include radical ideals to make them better citizens. They should make the world a better place or something like that. So you could perhaps find an eclectic way of kind of harmonizing pieces from different philosophies. So different combinations are okay. So any of these is okay, except like I said, if you're just behaviorist, that's probably cause for concern. So let's take a minute and talk to each other. Which one of these would you identify with? And how would you implement that? If you say, I like the progressive ideas and I like some of the humanistic ideas, what should that mean for your teaching? Or if you think, I like kind of liberal and progressive, well, how would that look like in your teaching? How would you teach according to a liberal progressive outlook? So talk to each other for a couple of minutes about this. Okay, let me call on a couple of you to share maybe your ideas. How about right there? What would be your preferred philosophy? Yes.
Well, my major is law, so lots of my teachers were close to behavioralists. Yeah, so I haven't think about another types. Yeah.
Okay. Probably if you could do it differently than your teachers, your professors, how would you like to do it?
If possible, I want to be a kind of progressive teacher.
Okay.
Of course, I think communication is very important to learn something.
Okay. So as a law professor, you might want to give your students, you might want to do more interactive activities, and you might want to have them maybe solve actual cases, case studies, things like that. Something that's more hands-on rather than you just dumping information on your students. And you might you might do the survey, this inventory, and look at some of the particular criteria that correlate to the progressive category, and think about what would that look like as a law professor. What would be some progressive interactive kinds of things that you could do as a law professor. And actually a lot of these will tend to overlap, progressive and humanist, and also radical. Let me get someone else. What would you prefer?
I prefer radical.
Radical, okay. So what would you do as a radical teacher?
major is engineering.
Mm-hmm.
I think basic is important. Why we should do that?
Mm-hmm.
I want to teach the students about why.
Okay. So talking to students about why we're doing engineering, that's one thing you might do. And also, and especially in some fields like engineering, if you're radical, you might like to do community service projects. Maybe have your students do what's called service learning, where as a class project, you go out into the community and you do something that's going to help some people, especially disadvantaged people. It might be having your students design some engineering project that's going to benefit poor people or benefit handicapped people or students who are struggling, something that's going to help the community. And that's kind of a hands-on practical learning. It's out in the community. It's teaching your students to do something that's going to benefit other people. So service learning, and if you're radical, especially service learning opportunities might be good. If you're a language teacher, you might want to, or if you're maybe an education professor, you might want to have your students do some sort of community service things that help poor students, that help students who are struggling academically, students from disadvantaged backgrounds. Or in other fields, you might do community projects with your students. Okay, maybe let's hear from one more person. Can I get a volunteer? Or I'll call on somebody. Okay, notice people are looking down to avoid eye contact with me. So in that case, I will call, yes, you in the blue back there.
I must say my favorite style is something.
Okay.
Because basically, I think it depends on the case
Okay.
and condition. So for example, if I'm a professor at university, maybe I should be very liberal.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, if I'm a instructor in army,
Mm-hmm.
I should be more behavioristic.
Certainly. Yes. Yes. So if you're a professor, maybe you have certain liberal ideals, and that could also be balanced sometimes with a little bit of, progressive or humanistic sometimes, so that you're not always just talking. Maybe some balance might be good, so you can maybe realize your ideals sometimes by making classes more interactive. Okay. So these are some things to think about. So you might want to do this inventory, the PAEI inventory on the website, fill it out and see where you actually are, and see if you agree with your results. Maybe it says you're a behaviorist, and like, oh my, why am I behaviorist? It may be because of how you were taught in the past or certain assumptions you haven't thought about. So take this and find out where you really stand and think about, do I agree with that? Does your explicit philosophy agree with your implicit philosophy, what this says you really would do in a classroom? And if you don't agree with it, if you don't like it, then how would you change? Well, you might, as a teacher, start to experiment with maybe more interactive activities, maybe more group activities. In the following sessions, the following Friday seminars, we will talk more about interactive learning, group-based learning, challenge-based or problem-based learning. We'll talk about more of those techniques in the coming few weeks. So you might experiment with those in order to change your teaching style and learn more about how to do that in teaching. If you find that you're too conservative or too traditional, you might think of ways of experimenting with other more modern techniques in your teaching, or ways of balancing it out, ways of maybe talking less as a lecturer and having students do more activities so that you're not so teacher-centered.
Well, however, the thing is that as a teacher, we have we are challenged like some obstacles because the students' attitude toward activities. So
yes.
We want them to be involved in group activities or work, but actually many students hate it. That's
Yes.
the problem because I want to be a humanistic teacher, but they say no. So we
Yes.
want to be back by you. Please
Yes.
do that, okay?
Yes, and those students are products of the educational system. Their very traditional style classes have trained them that way, and in the one of the later workshops, one of the later Friday sessions, we will talk about, say, group activities, and we'll talk about how to overcome student resistance to that. How do you overcome student resistance? And the students don't want to do group activities or interactive activities. We'll talk about that later at a later session. So come back for then. Now, for a job interview, or maybe for writing a teaching statement, it's helpful to do this so you can be self-aware of where you are and what you would do in a classroom and how you'd want to do things and why you'd want to do things in a certain way, why you'd want to teach in a certain way, even why you want to teach. Now, when it comes to an interview or job application materials like your cover letter or your teaching statement, you probably don't want to use these terms unless you're applying to a college of education where people know these terms, because if you just say, I'm a radical, they might misunderstand that term. Because this has a special meaning in education philosophy, and educational psychology. But if you just say, I'm a radical, they might think, oh, you're what? You like North Korea or something? If you say, I'm humanistic, they might not know what that means, because this has other meanings. If you say, I'm a progressive or a liberal, they might think, oh, you vote for the Democratic Party, so what? So you might not use these extra terms, but you might look at the inventory in some of the specific questions in that teaching inventory, and some of the questions that particularly resonate with you. So you might look at the inventory and says, oh yeah, I like this question about encouraging the learner, the student, to take responsibility for his or her learning. I like that, and think of specific examples of how you do that in a classroom, and then write about it or talk about it in your job interview. So, just pick a few of these sample questions from this inventory that kind of resonate with you, that you really like, and think of specific examples, how you would do that in class, in your teaching, and then talk about that or write about that. This teaching philosophy manual has a few other things to think about also. How to improve your teaching, how would you reflect about yourself and improve your teaching. You can read that on your own. Or how would you teach certain things that are particularly difficult for students to understand. Like if you're teaching biology, some students really have conceptual problems with the theory of evolution, and they don't really understand evolution properly. Well, as a biology teacher, how would you get past that? How would you help them to understand what a theory really is in science, or what evolution really means in science? Get past popular misconceptions. If you're a physics teacher, how would you help your students overcome common misunderstandings about Newton's laws of motion? How would you overcome those? If you're a language teacher, how would you help your students to really struggle with difficult things like the English perfect tense, and how to master the English perfect tense or English articles like A and the? And that's in this book. This booklet on teaching philosophy. And these are things that you might think about for your job interview, for improving your own teaching, for job application materials. Another thing you might think about, there's also another teaching style inventory I put on the website, which I don't have time to talk about, but it kind of goes along with some of this personality stuff I'm about to talk about, and you can look at that on your own. But I also put something on the website about MBTI. It's also in your handout. Have any of you taken an MBTI? Okay, a couple of you. I think you can take it at the counseling center over there. I think it's free, and they're also kind of free online MBTIs. So those of you who took it, what's your MBTI type?
ISTJ.
Okay, ISTJ. I'm INTP, and actually my wife is the very opposite. My wife is ESFJ. She's the complete opposite of me. And actually it works out well in our case, in marriage. Does anybody not know MBTI? It's kind of popular here. It's a popular psychological inventory of personality preferences, and it is good for self-discovery, for understanding yourself. A couple of cautions. It is not a test about ability or expertise. Some Korean companies give MBTIs to their employees in order to place them in certain jobs. That's wrong. It's not a test of how good you are at these things. This is simply a test of your preferences. What are your preferred decision-making processes, your preferred kind of mood processing, your preferred social interaction methods. You could be an extrovert, but you could be incompetent. And actually, if you've ever worked with a person like that, it's really annoying. People who are extroverted, but they lack social skills. That's possible. I've dealt with people like that. And they are annoying. They like to be the center of attention. They don't care about other people. They just like to be outgoing, but they're not good at it. So it doesn't mean necessarily you're good at something. It's just what you prefer. Another caution. Sometimes when you take MBTI, maybe 2 or 3 times, you might get slightly different results. And I think there's a good reason for that. I don't think these are necessarily either or, like you're not necessarily just judging or perceiving. You might be kind of in the middle. You probably tend more one way or the other. And so if you've, like in my case, I'm intuitive, but I'm not so strongly intuitive. I'm kind of toward the middle. I'm also somewhat sensing. So I am classified as intuitive, meaning I like kind of abstract conceptual thinking, dealing with abstractions and concepts. This is kind of more the hands-on kind of person, a hands-on learner, a hands-on teacher. Sensing. So I like this too. I like doing experiments, experimental work. But ultimately, the core of my being is a preference for the abstract or conceptual. And it depends on probably the situation or the circumstance. So in this case, if I take the test and one time it says I'm this, but another time it says I'm this, well, I'm probably this, but I'm kind of toward the middle, and it probably depends on maybe when I take the test what kind of mood I'm in, what I was doing before that. Before that, if I was reading kind of a theoretical article, or if I was analyzing results of my experiment, it might bias me one way or the other when I take the MBTI. So that's one caution. So these can actually influence your teaching style, and this is good to think about. If you've not had an MBTI, it's good for understanding your personality preferences, because some of these can influence your teaching style or your learning style. So if you're an introvert or an extrovert, how do you think that would influence your teaching? First of all, let's clarify, what is an introvert? In proper psychological terminology, what's an introvert? Does it mean someone who's antisocial? No. In the psychology terminology, this has to do with how you derive your mental, personal energy. If you're an extrovert, you get your energy from social interaction. If you're an introvert, you get your energy from being alone. And you like to be alone. It doesn't mean that you don't like being with people. It's just that if you're with people too much, you get tired. And you have to withdraw, you have to spend time by yourself to recharge. You need to recharge your energy by being alone, maybe by meditation or just thinking or just being away from people. If you're an extrovert, you get your energy from social interaction, and you're not as comfortable with being alone and trying to learn meditation and stuff. So if you're a teacher, how would that affect your teaching style? Because actually I'm an introvert, I'm INTP, but I love teaching, so there's no conflict. But what does that mean if you're an introvert and you're teaching?
You don't have, I mean, actually, I don't mean that never ever, but sometimes, you do want any, collaboration from other peers or teachers.
Mm-hmm.
So you research something alone, and you have to, use it and apply it.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of you enjoy alone, not rather than sharing with other teachers.
Okay, sometimes as a student you might prefer doing activities by yourself, not doing group activities. And as a teacher, it might mean you prefer teaching by yourself and not having to collaborate with colleagues or peers, or at least not too much. And you don't want other peers and colleagues telling you what to do. You like to teach the way you want to do, the way you want to teach. That's one implication. What are other implications of being an introverted or extroverted teacher?
Actually, I am INTP too, and I learn more from readings than discussion with other people.
Okay. And it's good to be aware of that as yourself as a teacher, and the fact that some of your students who are introverts might prefer individual activities too. They do have to do group activities, of course, but that's necessary, as we'll talk about later in later sessions, but they will tend to prefer doing learning by themselves if they're very introverted. Okay. If you're a teacher and you're introverted, that means that after class you need to withdraw. You need to find a quiet place where you can be alone in order to recharge. Otherwise you probably go crazy if you don't take care of yourself. You have to take care of yourself more personally if you're an introvert. You really need to make sure you can recharge your energy by yourself, whether it's being in your office by yourself or walking, taking walks, whatever works for you. You have to take more care of yourself. If you're an extrovert, you're probably going to love talking to your students and chatting with your students a lot, and your colleagues and everybody else. Just don't drive the introverts crazy by talking to them too much. We introverts sometimes need to be left alone, and we will resent extroverts who try to dominate our time and our social space. Now, intuitive sensing. This is kind of reflected also in the teaching style inventory that I put on the website, part of it. Intuitive people, like me, we like abstract thinking, concepts. I often like to do theoretical research, theoretical papers sometimes. But like I said, I'm kind of somewhat in the middle, so if I do too much of that, I go crazy. If I'm doing just theory all the time, I go crazy. I have to do something practical. I need to do some real research based on that, empirical research, like quantitative research with subjects and statistics. I have to do that. But if I'm doing the experiments and the statistics all the time, I'll get burned out, because I need some theoretical basis for what I'm doing, or some theoretical application, or the theory needs some practical application. I started doing theoretical linguistics and I got really tired of it because I saw no practical application for what I was doing, and so I moved to teaching. If you're a teacher, if you like working with concepts and abstractions all the time, or if you like the practical hands-on stuff all the time, what does that mean for your teaching? If you do too much of one or the other, too much theoretical or too much hands-on.
Polarization, no in the middle, instead of no combination, no mixture.
Yeah, so you have to be careful if you're strongly intuitive. As a teacher, you may talk too much about theoretical or abstract stuff, and it's going to be boring because the students will be lost. Because students are not going to learn if they cannot connect it to something practical or specific. And some people are really good at talking about theoretical stuff, but they can't connect it to something specific, and the classroom seems like, oh, what did I learn from this class? I didn't really learn anything, it's just theory. I've had classes like that. If your style is, if your cognitive style is all sensing, what does that mean for you as a teacher?
There's no direction in teaching.
It might mean you focus a lot on the details and maybe giving a lot of practical examples and problem-solving activities. That'll be good for the students. But then they'll feel lost if that's all that you do as a teacher. If you're only talking about practical examples and there's no direction or guidance, some kind of a theory or structure, no conceptual structure or rationale or basis for what we're learning, for what we're doing in the class. So you have to watch out if you're strongly intuitive, if you're strongly sensing. You need to balance that out, otherwise your students will be lost if you go in one extreme too much or the other. This is a fun one. Thinking, feeling. I'm a thinker. I'm a thinking type. When it comes to decision making and what I do, I'm a very logical, rational kind of person. I don't care much about emotions, about if I do something, I do it based on reasoning or what's right or wrong, not so much based on my feelings or other people's feelings. What could be the possible problem as a teacher if you're a strongly thinking type?
No empathy.
Okay, perhaps not empathy. And as a teacher, you need to give empathy when it comes to what?
It's like giving a one-way direction lectures, like what we saw on the video.
Yeah, just do it.
Yeah,
Just do it. Yeah, I know you can do it, you know. It's that kind of a Hungarian accent. I think the guy was Hungarian. So lack of direction could be one problem. Lack of empathy, particularly when you give feedback. Teachers need to give positive feedback as well as honest feedback. And we'll talk about that later when we talk about assessment in a later session. If you're a thinker type, you probably don't need much encouragement and praise to motivate yourself to do what you do, but your students do, especially if your students are feeler types. If they're kind of more emotionally sensitive types, they need more encouragement, they need positive input, encouragement, praise. And if you're a thinker type like me, I have to work extra hard to try to point out some positive things as well as negative things when I'm giving feedback on my students' projects or their essays. Otherwise, it could be just too direct, too critical, and kind of uncaring and unempathetic. Especially feeler type students need that. They need some encouragement and praise as well as pointing out problems and things to fix. If you're a feeler, you might get burned out because people don't give you enough encouragement or affirmation or praise or positive feedback as well as constructive feedback. And you might get burned out, you might get discouraged easily. So you probably need to find some colleagues that you can confide in and find people who can build you up and support you as a teacher. As a thinker, feelers are really good at giving praise. So if you're a feeler, though, that's going to be good for your teaching because it's easy for you to give students praise, positive encouragement, and they will appreciate that. Unless they're really thinkers, then they probably won't care. I'm a thinker, and sometimes my feeler friends will say, "Oh, Kent, you did a great job." I'm like, I don't care. It's like, I don't need a lot of praise. Just a little. I need a little bit, but I don't like excessive praise, like some of what my feeler friends do. Like, "Oh, that's so great." Well, it just sounds insincere, and so I'll kind of ignore it, brush it off. And so, if your students react like that, it might be because they're strong thinkers, or they're just very discouraged and they're too discouraged to respond. So as teachers, think about, are you more of a feeler type or a thinker type, and how is that going to influence how you interact with students, how you give them feedback, praise and encouragement? How can you balance it out if you're if you go strong in one of these dimensions? You might need to balance that out and make a conscious effort. There are strengths and disadvantages to each of these. The last one is maybe a bit less critical for teaching. How many of you as students maybe are comfortable, you're okay when you don't understand something? Or when things are kind of open-ended and there's no clear answer. Do you feel comfortable, or does that make you feel anxious? Anxious. You're probably a judging type if you feel anxious. Judgers like to come to decisions quickly and move on. And judgers will get impatient if they don't understand something. And your students might get impatient and give up if they don't understand something, especially if they are judging types. These are the decision makers. They'll probably grow up, they'll probably become good business people who like to make quick decisions and move on. The bad thing is sometimes you need to wait and collect more information to make a good decision. If you're especially a language learner, a perceiving type personality can be an advantage. Perceivers are okay. I'm a perceiver. We're okay if we don't understand something. I'll wait. I'll figure it out someday. Or this is open-ended. There's no real clear answer here. I'm okay with that. I'm comfortable with that. And also good if you're a philosopher or a literature person or a humanities person, where things are not so clear-cut or absolute. if you're too much like this, though, then you're indecisive. But in terms of being a researcher, if you're a researcher, it can be good if you're a perceiver type because you want to get as much information as you can. You want to learn as much as you can before you commit to something or before you make decisions. So as a researcher, it can be a good trait. As long as you're not too indecisive and too open. So this is perhaps a quality that's more relevant to students and understanding your students, or to maybe being a researcher. But the first three are particularly important for you as a teacher, understanding where you are, and also understanding your students and where you and your students might have personality clashes. Now on the website there is a TSI, a teaching style inventory, and one of the dimensions on that kind of correlates to this intuitive sensing, and I kind of talked about that. If you're too theoretical in your teaching, or if you're too practical and hands-on, then you have to find a balance. And you can look at that later. The TSI is there's a spreadsheet. You just kind of take an inventory, and the spreadsheet kind of tells you where you are. That's a separate thing on the website I put up yesterday. Okay, so for your own self-development, it's helpful to understand where you are here, and where you are here in terms of your personality preferences and how these might affect your teaching. And these might be things to think about in terms of improving your teaching, or when you start teaching, and what to be aware of maybe when you go for that job interview, when you apply for a job as a lecturer or teacher, as a 강사, or someday hopefully a professor. So these are important things to understand about yourself, and improving yourself for your self-awareness and how you teach, and what your teaching style is going to be like, and what you'll do in the classroom. So do you have any questions? Well, usually Korean students we're not going to ask questions. Okay, good, a question.
I have a question regarding the philosophy. I think she briefly mentioned that if there's a student who's resistant in terms of their involvement in class discussions, when it comes to teaching, there can be some external factors sort of, stem from making and implementing your own philosophy of teaching.
Yes.
Such as there can be bureaucratic issues, and
yes.
Also the students, they sort of refuse to attend a class. Would it be like, should as a teacher or a professor, should they sort of change the philosophy of teaching, by the environment, or should they just, pursue their sort of philosophy and go for what he or she thinks?
That's a good question. So you can be under institutional constraints. It'll probably be worse if you're a Hagwon teacher, or maybe a public school teacher, where they say you have to do this, you have to teach like this. It's probably easiest if you're a professor, or even maybe as a 강사, where even as a 강사 you have a good deal of freedom, I think, in terms of how you're teaching, because there are so many 강사 out there. The university is not going to be able to control you, except when it comes to rehiring you, your contract. It's generally, and my recommendation is to try to be more student-centered and to adopt more modern interactive teaching methods as best you can. You might find yourself in a teaching situation like as a Hagwon teacher, a high school teacher, or some kind of teaching environment where you're more strictly controlled and you have less freedom. So you might just try to adapt as much as you can, to do what you can to get away with, and try to balance what you want to do with what you have to do. So you might not have as much freedom to teach in the kind of liberal, progressive, humanistic style as you want to. You can try to do as much as you can to be a little more student-centered, and to encourage the students to do real learning and active learning as much as you can, but you may be very restricted in certain teaching environments. So yeah, my advice is just to do what you can to follow your teaching philosophy, depending on the restrictions that you have. Okay, yes?
I'd like to mention that regarding the psychological and personal traits between the teacher and the students, and the teacher, of course, is one teacher, but lots of more students in your classroom. So one teacher has different personality. For example, here at Jersey Work of Living, and we have to balance out the students, but we have so many kinds of personalities in one classroom, so
Yes.
we cannot focus on one specific student. Right?
Yes.
There's so many students that have a different personalities, so it is really sometimes difficult for the teacher to, just satisfy all the students. So some of students and other students who are not satisfied or fed about me, then they complaining a lot.
Yes.
That's the problem. So we can face that sometimes.
Okay.
Challenges those students.
Yeah, and I think in a later workshop I'll talk about learning styles and such, and the idea of learning styles is very popular right now in the educational world, but as I will explain in a future workshop, you don't want to focus too much on this learning styles because a lot of it is a little bit extreme or has gone too far. In terms of this, you can consciously modify this by altering your classroom activities and such, and kind of becoming more student-centered. In fact, after you teach, you might want to retake this inventory in one or 2 years or every couple of years and see how you're changing to get where you want to be. Now this stuff you can't really change. These are long-term stable personality preferences, so you can't change your core personality preferences. But what you can do is kind of make sure you're not going too extreme in your classroom teaching. You're not being too extremely intuitive. That you prefer intuitive, but you have to try to get some more practical examples in your lectures and have students do practical problem-solving activities. And what you want to do here, for example, is to avoid, in your own personalities, to avoid some extremes that might hurt your teaching and your classroom interaction. So here you don't want to be too withdrawn from your students. You have to make yourself available here to your students. You don't want to overburden your students if you're excessively extroverted and you're also a social show-off. Particularly here, I think, though, where you mainly need to make sure that if you are extremely one way or another on these two dimensions, you want to make sure that your extremes don't affect how you interact with your students. That your extremes don't affect your classroom teaching in a bad way. If you're an extreme thinker, maybe your extreme thinker students might be okay, but you have to balance it out and try to cultivate more empathy in how you teach and achieve kind of a happy medium. You can't change yourself from a thinker to a feeler. You can't change, but you can kind of find a more appropriate balance. Even though you're a thinker, you can try to cultivate more encouraging habits and words and feedback so that your students aren't hurt unnecessarily or offended unnecessarily by the feedback you give on their tests. So it's kind of more of a matter of finding an appropriate balance for yourself and your students' needs. So in the coming few weeks, we're going to talk about learning styles. We're going to talk about using group work, types of group activities and interactive activities in modern teaching methods, kind of what we call active learning or interactive learning. We'll talk about assessment issues, kind of like we touched upon here, how to assess and do grading. For example, when you have a big class of 100 students, how do you grade papers? For a big class like that, we'll talk about those kinds of issues in the coming weeks. Pedagogical methods, pedagogical techniques. All right, thank you, and hope to see you next week.
Thank you.